Welcome to the group project for the Environmental Sociology course here at California State University in Long Beach. In this video, we will explore the impact of the global food regime, starting with an exploration of what a food regime is, as well as what regimes have held power over the course of history. Next will be an exploration of the impact that global food regimes have on vulnerable communities and landscapes, and how the capitalist agricultural industry contributes to food insecurity around the world. Lastly, we will conclude with how David Pello's four pillars of critical environmental justice intertwines with global food regimes. So, what exactly is a food regime? Authors Eric Holt-Giménez and Wang define a food regime as a rule-governed structure of production and consumption of food on a world scale. The first global food regime was known as the Diasporic Colonial Food Regime and occurred between 1870 to 1914. This regime was defined by food imports to Europe from the colonies, linking food imports from Southern and American colonies to European industrial expansion. The second food regime, known as the Mercantile Industrial Food Regime, began after World War II and ran from 1947 to 1973. This regime reversed the flow of food from the northern to the southern hemisphere to fuel Cold War industrialization in the Third World, and it was framed as a development project with a host of interventions like food aid, green revolution technologies, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and the extension of international markets into the countryside. At the same time, a division of agricultural labor evolved at the international scale, with cheap labor in the former colonies facilitating the flow of commodities across national borders from poor to richer countries. The modern corporate food regime, known as the corporate environmental regime, was ushered in by the neoliberal policies of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and is characterized by the monopoly market power of agri-food corporations, globalized grain-fed meat production, giant retail, and growing links between food and fuel. This regime comprises a massive agri-food industrial complex which includes Monsanto, Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, Congra, and Walmart. Together, these corporations dominate the government agencies and multilateral organizations that make and enforce the regime's rule, regulations, and projects for trade, labor, property, and technology, including the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, the UN World Food Program, USAID, the USDA, and big philanthropy. They have selectively adopted the language and goals of environmental and social movements, with food chains promoting their high-priced, organic food aisles, which are separated from regular and usually more affordable food items. As part of the capitalist system, global food regimes have historically alternated between periods of economic liberalization, characterized by unregulated markets, privatization, and massive concentrations of wealth. With the recurrent global food crisis, actions is most certainly needed. However, little of the aid promised by the U.S. to combat this crisis has actually been committed to the cause, and where it has. It has been used to support more of the same policies which have created this desperate situation in the first place, such as extending free markets, privatization of common resources, including forests and the atmosphere, proprietary technological fixes, including genetically modified seeds, and protecting monopoly concentration. Furthermore, collateral damage to the community food systems is mitigated by weekly safety nets, such as food aid from the World Food Program and U.S. banks or food stamps.
Now that we have explained the history of global food regimes and the circumstances of the contemporary food regime we now face, we can explore the ways in which the contemporary global agri-capitalist food regime impacts vulnerable communities and landscapes, and the ways in which this industrial complex also fuels food insecurity around the world as viewed through the lenses of food justice and food sovereignty. In her article, The Global Food System Still Benefits the Rich at the Expense of the Poor, author Laura Pereira examines how today's global food regime exploits the poor to the benefit of the rich, arguing that while global trade has helped to lift many individuals out of poverty, the patterns in which food is distributed around the world still follow colonial industrial trends from the past, which has resulted in an uneven distribution of access to nutritious food and the rise of food-related health problems, such as obesity and diabetes. The modern global food regime allows wealthy shoppers in developed countries to not only add unusual non-local foods to their diets through importation, but that very same mechanism also allows those with money to be selective about where their food originates. At the same time, less wealthy shoppers, particularly those living in less developed countries, are more likely to eat foods such as maize or rice, which are less nutritious due to the way in which they are processed and which tend to require unsustainable farming practices for their production, such as using more water in places where it's already a scarce resource. In order to change these patterns, a new way of engaging with the complexity of food systems is needed, and a new approach that recognizes that systemic changes must be adopted as a more systemic approach could help shift the global food system by raising public recognition that food production must become more environmentally sustainable and must be designed in a way that meets the needs of the world's people in an equitable and just manner in order to be socially and environmentally just. Unless there is a strong pressure from civil society, reformists will not likely affect, much less reverse, the present neoliberal direction of the corporate food regime. Thus, fixing the dysfunctional food system in any sustainable sense requires regime change. It is due to this need for systemic change that progressive movements such as food justice, as well as more radical movements such as food sovereignty, have arisen. These food movements focus on the lack of nutritional healthy food access, social and distributional inequities, institutional racism and classism, and the need to address labor, gender, and human rights in the food system. These groups call for structural redistributive reforms of basic entitlements, for example, for property, labor, capital, and markets, as well as advance a progressive agenda on the basis of sustainable family farming and rights of access to healthy food. While the progressive trend focuses on the local ownership of production and on improving the service and delivery aspects of the food system, the radical trend directs more of its energy at structural changes to capitalist food systems. When taken together, both trends seek to change the rules and practices of food systems, locally, nationally, and internationally.
With the application of David Pello's 4 pillars of critical environmental justice, we will now explore how intersectionality, multi-scale analysis, state power, and indispensability connect with the social and environmental justice issues caused by today's corporate environmental regime. It is easy to see the ways in which the first pillar, intersectionality, applies to the problems created by the modern global food regime when we look at the way in which women and children are particularly vulnerable to food insecurity and labor exploitation issues within the global food system, particularly those located in the global south. Women and children frequently make up the majority of the workforces used in large-scale industrial farming, such as in the case of palm oil plantations, where they are exposed to hazardous and toxic working conditions, while simultaneously facing issues of food security because of unsustainable wages. The second pillar of Pello's critical environmental justice, multi-scale analysis, allows us to more clearly see the ways in which the modern global food regime affects food security on all levels. At the macro level, we see this complex destroying the environment, ripping up natural landscapes to install industrial agricultural farms, and contributing to global climate change through not only this practice, but also through the use of toxic pesticides and chemicals. On the micro level, we see that this complex exploits workers across the globe, leaving them in poor health and without the means to support themselves or their families. The third pillar, state power, is also important as we are actively seeing the ways in which governments collude with big business in the pursuit of capital gains, and the ways in which corporations are installing members of their businesses within political posts to further advance their exploitive agendas. As many food justice movements will point out, the state is not an active agent for systemic change because it is the system, so the state cannot be relied upon to assist in the call for action against the agro-industrial complex. Finally, the fourth pillar of Pello's critical environmental justice framework is indispensability, which refers to the need for the inclusion of excluded, marginalized, and othered populations in the determination of our collective futures. The current global food regime is capitalist by nature, and it is simply not possible to fix capitalism with more capitalism. Instead, our collective fate rests on the resurrection of more sustainable practices used by various cultures around the world throughout history, such as land stewardship and local communal farming practices. When speaking on the issues associated with the current food regime, it can be argued that the fourth pillar is perhaps the most important if we are to have any hope for a more sustainable future. As we have demonstrated, global food regimes, particularly the one we currently face, disempower communities around the world, denying food access, creating food insecurity, and exploiting both people and the environment in the pursuit of expansion and capital gains. Movements such as the food justice and food sovereignty movements play a pivotal role in the fight against agro-capitalist exploitation, while the application of David Pello's pillars of critical environmental justice pushes sociologists to form a more critical understanding of how food regimes affect and shape society, making it clear that we must fight to relocalize food if we want to put power back in the hands of the people.